Now let's get an update from our Cape and Island State Senator Julian Cyr. Julian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be with you.
We're going to talk a little bit about the storm that happened last week. I know we're kind of coming into maybe another storm this week, but let's talk about last week. It was pretty bad.
We have had not only last week, but now at this point we've had 4 nor'easters, 3 in quick succession, and then the January 4th storm. On this latest storm, the tides were with us, so we didn't see the unprecedented storm surges that we saw in the prior storms, but what we did have is this very wet snow and really pummeled our electricity supply, and we had major failure of the grid out here on the Cape. Most of my constituents that I represent across Cape Cod, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, lost power at some point. I know there were people who were lucky like you who didn't, but most of us did lose power at one point, and not only for losing power for a few hours, but for days.
Yes.
And so we had over 100 people in 3 shelters across the Cape. Really concerning, particularly given the vulnerable population we have.
Yes.
Certainly I think when storms like this happen here, you do certainly have down power lines and trees. But my concern is that, look, we pay, here in Barnstable County, we pay some of the highest electricity rates, not in the Commonwealth, in the country. And I really have some big questions for Eversource, our utility, about what investments are being made into the infrastructure that we have.
Right.
So, transformers. We had reports of sort of transformers sort of frizzing out, of telephone poles sort of breaking in half, problems at substations. That's indicative, not just of the effects of a storm, right, but of having aging, corroding equipment. And so the governor was down here last week. The entire delegation met with him, as well as county officials, town officials. And so we're working to do an after action on this. But really, I've got a lot of big questions around electricity. We've requested that the Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy hold a fact-finding hearing to bring in Eversource executives, to bring in the Department of Public Utilities to really give us some answers. This is 2018. We should figure out a way to have some reliable power service. And by the way, anecdotally, I heard from some constituents in Centerville who were saying that they had always had chronic problems on their street with their electricity supply, and a year or 2 ago they were loud enough and they pestered enough and they got Eversource to replace a transformer and make updates. They didn't lose power.
Wow.
And so I think we've got to look at that and really question the utility and say, are you using resources that we as ratepayers are paying for you to maintain this system? Are you making those investments so that when we have these storms, we can, we have resiliency, we don't lose power. If we do lose power, we can get right back online.
Right. And like you said, these storms came in such a quick succession that, you don't know, all the added things that are coming with that. It's like, so slowly it's getting damaged, and then you have 3 storms. It's like the first storm, okay, it's okay. The second storm, iffy, and then by the third storm, the whole thing goes down. And that's kind of brings us to AT&T, which I know was another issue during the storm. There were many people that just lost all communications.
The AT&T system basically failed. And also Comcast failed as well.
Right.
And so you had positions, particularly people are getting rid of their landlines. I don't have a landline.
Me either.
My parents in their home, they got rid of their landline a few years ago. And so you're in situations where I was at the shelter at Cape Cod Tech, and several people you asked to use, and I let them use my cell phone so they could call their children in other states and say, hey, I'm okay.
Right.
Really, really not acceptable. I think that there's a lot of lessons learned that are coming out of these storms. I think climate change is real and is happening. Cape Codders, have known that for some time. We're a hardy bunch. We're used to these sort of nor'easters.
Right.
But we need to do a better job around preparedness, around resiliency. The Senate last November passed a climate adaptation bill that I hope the House passes and that we send to the governor's desk. And then just last week, Governor Baker filed an environmental bond bill over, I think it's $1.4 billion, looking at coastal resiliency, looking at investments in infrastructure, yes, money for sort of coastal infrastructure, beach nourishment, seawalls, but also looking at road infrastructure. The amount of, sort of the flooding that we saw on 6A, in Chatham, in Provincetown, and Nantucket. How do we look at that? I think if we're being honest, I think with a rising tide, with rising sea level, we are going to have to, I think, change how we do some of our business here and have to make some hard choices. But I think we need to really have a process to have those conversations and be prepared for that. So I'm really looking forward to taking this up. Hopefully we'll see some significant resources coming to Cape Cod, coming to the islands. I do represent sort of the most coastline of any legislator in Massachusetts, so hopefully we'll get our fair share there because we need it.
Wonderful. It's all good to hear. We want to move on. We're going to talk about the Nuclear Decommissioning Advisory Panel is having a public meeting tonight at Cape Cod Community College at 6:30. What can you tell me about this meeting tonight?
Yes, so this is something that actually I had worked on establishing this decommissioning panel prior to joining the Senate when I worked at the Department of Public Health. I know these issues pretty well. We're entering a really critical phase in the saga that is Pilgrim, and that is this plant is slated for closure next year. There's a number of safety concerns while the plant is operating, but the interests of a whole host of folks in the region, yes, many constituents and folks in the Cape have been concerned about the safety of this plant, but also the town of Plymouth and people who work in this plant. How we go about the closure and decommissioning process in the next several years is going to dictate whether or not you and I are talking about Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station as a real threat to the region for the next several years or the next several decades.
Right.
So the decommissioning panel is having a meeting tonight. They're going to be at Cape Cod Community College, and the entire delegation, led by myself and led by Senator Julian, who represents the Upper Cape and, of course, Plymouth, will be presenting a series of recommendations that we have to the decommissioning panel and that we have to the administration. We need to file some legislation to hold Pilgrim a little more accountable. I think we're going to need to get some money for those recommendations to be implemented. And so we'll be presenting that tonight. But really a critical moment in Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station. I continue to be concerned about this plant. I've called for this plant to be closed numerous times. But with this plant closing, we really have to do our due diligence to make sure the interests of the Commonwealth, and particularly those of us who live out here on Land's End, are protected.
Yeah, it's a very sensitive and it's a difficult issue to deal with. So I'm glad that that's something that you've kind of
and there's no daylight, in the delegation on this. I mean, this is a truly like on most issues, working very collaboratively in a bipartisan fashion. So I'm looking forward to being part of that conversation tonight.
Wonderful, Julian.
And encourage viewers to come.
Oh, definitely.
Please come.
Come to Cape Cod Community College tonight at 6:30. Is there anything else you'd like our viewers to be aware of before I let you go?
Well, I'll come back next month. And
Okay, good.
I think we're going to have some big news on wastewater and being able to provide over $1 billion in relief to taxpayers on wastewater projects across the Cape. So let's talk about that next time.
Great.
All right.
Sounds good to me.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Julian. My guest today is Julian Cyr, the Cape and Island State Senator.